Okay, so in the previous video, you saw how to use the bottle web server and REST framework along with the PyDAL database abstraction layer to form a backend in this little full stack toolkit. Now we're going to take a look at the jsLinb front-end framework to create the user interfaces for apps that'll connect with the bottle and PyDAL backend. Main benefit of jsLinb is that it works in a massive variety of web browsers, including ancient web browsers like Internet Explorer 6, basically all the oldest mobile and desktop browsers. And it supports those browsers in ways that modern frameworks don't. Plus, it's got a great little IDE and visual drag and drop environment that allows you to build applications quickly. So the way to get to it is go to your folder that you've downloaded, and you'll see there's a subfolder called UI. And we've got a number of these jslim tutorial.js files. These are JavaScript files. And these JavaScript files are a mixture of handwritten code and code that is generated by the visual drag and drop layout builder. So the way this works is we're going to run the bottle server like you've seen. So in this case, I am going to run the example that you saw last, which was bottle tutorial 8. So that in that tutorial, we had the PyDAL library functions, those CRUD functions, create, read, update, and delete functions running inside the bottle REST framework, so that we had endpoints to do create, read, update, and delete using PyDAL to save those operations, those values and those operations to the database. So that's running now. And what you're going to see, if you remember from that previous example, is if you go to localhost, it serves up an index.html file, which we're going to use for our front end. So let's just take a look at that really quickly. If we go back to our bottle PyDAL jslim folder, you'll see along with that, where all those tutorials are, we've got a little index.html file. Let's take a look at that really quickly. That, turn this again, that has the following code. All it is a bunch of links. You can see here, there's a link for the UI builder, a link for a file called test.html, which we'll use to test our application during the development cycle, an example.html, which is just an example like the one we're going to build here in the tutorial, an example.js, which is just the JavaScript that's run in that example.html file, and then a couple other JavaScript files that form, nice simple templates for creating apps in jslim. You can see all these links. All these links go to files that are in the UI subfolder. So all these HTML and JavaScript files are in the UI subfolder in the zip file that you've downloaded. Again, there's nothing else to install. These files all run in the browser, so you don't even have to have Python installed for this. Nothing else is required except a browser, and just about any browser will work. These jslim examples actually even run in the Kindle experimental browser and lots of other browsers that you really can't do much else with, but you can use the full feature set of the jslim library even in those very limited browser environments. Okay, so what we've got when we go to that local host, which is now being served by the bottle application, is all these links. If I open up the UI builder, that opens UI builder.html, which is in the UI folder, and this runs the JavaScript drag and drop builder as part of jslim library. And it works and looks a lot like all the old familiar visual type builders. There are a number of widgets on the left-hand side, which you can drag out, and you can do things like duplicate easily and quickly. And on the right-hand side, there is a set of properties and events. So if I click on this button, you can see that tells us the name, and there's a caption here which we can adjust. Let's just do that, press this button. And I managed to mess up that typing. Let's do it again. Mouse is a little sticky. Try that one more time. This is entirely an issue with my mouse. There we go. Button. Press enter. Here we go. And of course, you can resize. If you use the arrow buttons, you can move these widgets around, so you don't have to do it with the mouse. If you hold shift and use the arrow buttons, you can resize. If you do control, you can inch these things around in pixels. So normally it snaps to the grid here. If you use control and the arrow keys, it moves things around exactly where you want them. And now you've got a list of properties. There are some of the most common properties in the events directly at the top here. So for example, the caption, and then the on-click event is very important. So whenever that button is clicked, it will run this function. If that function hasn't been created for you, clicking on this little thing will automatically create the function with a nice little template to get it started. And there are a number of other properties. So you can adjust the sizing and a lot of the other features of the widget over in the properties panel. And then there's also an events panel. So depending on the events that are that occur with that widget, so before rendering or after rendering or when you dock it or so on moving it, any sort of thing like that, you have events to handle each of those sorts of operations that might occur in the user interface. So to build a user interface, we're going to drag widgets, we're going to drag containers, navigation elements and media elements and that sort of thing onto the palette. And you can look at your entire application up here. You see the canvas, and you can see all of the elements, even if they're hidden up here, and click on them and it will select that particular element. There are some other tools for doing things like aligning widgets to the grid and so on. You can select multiple widgets. So if we grab a couple of widgets here, drag them onto the screen, you can select over them and then move them all as a group. Okay, so it's real easy to build things. If I want to align those all, you can see now I've got a number of widgets here. It'll align it as we want. Okay, so very, very simple to lay out widgets. You can create one widget. If you need a lot of those similar widgets, you can duplicate, and then the properties will be copied over. Just give them each a new name. Okay, so let's delete these things. And actually, I'm going to restart that with the default little layout there. And so we got a button. Now you'll see this button already in the example has an on-click method handler function that will run when the user clicks. You click on this and it brings you over here into the code view. So to build applications, you're going to switch between the design view and the code view. And this is a fully round trip capable WYSIWYG environment. So you can drag widgets here. And the way this works is it appears in your code like this, just to get a good idea how this code works. For every widget you create, you're going to see an append in this area of the code. So the UI builder is automatically creating this code. You can edit it manually. You can create it manually. You don't need the WYSIWYG builder at all. This is just a library that you can include in your HTML files. Write the JavaScript manually, but the visual designer really helps. And if we make a change here, say I make the set left property 250 and the 50 there, try it again, 250. And if I set the top to, let's make that 200, you'll see that this widget is now moved down the screen when I go back to the design view. And if I move this around over here, you'll see that the code is then again adjusted in the code section. Now, so that's the main little syntax and structure that you need to understand. These appends are all widgets that get added, and all the properties of those widgets that get added in the visual builder. I'm going to take a label, for example, move it over here. Now, if we go back to the code, you can see they've appended appended a label with these properties, and we again can adjust those in code, or we can adjust those properties using the editor over here. So if I want to change the caption, I can do that here in the properties, but I can also go over here. You can see it's been adjusted in the code, and I can adjust the code, run back to the design view, and you can see that that's been reflected in the visual layout editor. So visual layout editor is a really nice little quick system to set up and manipulate the code. Really helpful for building applications more quickly. Now, one of the most important parts of this whole system is the on-click or on-event handlers. So I go here, it'll bring me automatically to the code that's going to run when a click event occurs on that button. And you can see it automatically puts in a little bit of a shell. It constructs these handler functions with the syntax you need. So this includes a reference to the object that was clicked or the object that otherwise had an event occur. It also gives you a couple of variables. The UI control variable generally refers to, these are local variables that refer to the widget to which the event occurred. And here what's going to run is part of the lim library. One of the things in the lim library is an alert function. And so it's going to say, hi, and it gets the name of the control that was clicked. So let's go back. And if we run this, the way we're going to do this is take the code, Control A, Control C. And what I'm going to do is bring this back into, I've got a little test.js file. And I'm just going to save that with the new code, go back to the browser, and go back to the browser and run the test.html. And now you can see when I run this, click it, it says, hi, and it gives you the name of the widget that was clicked. So for this little toolkit, we're going to use that process, that development workflow, to build and design the layout and write the functions we need in this little IDE. And one of the greatest things about this IDE is that it's got autocomplete. So if I want to, for example, set the text that's on the button when it gets clicked, what we can do is we use this. Actually, no, let's make a new one here. I'm going to show you how this works from the beginning. Let's make a new button, drag it on the screen. Let's give that a little bit of text. It just says, like me. Okay, so you've seen that. Let's make that little button a little bit bigger. Go. And let's see here. We will create a button handler for this, and you can see the name. Let's give this button handler, call it, by default, they all have, widgets have the prefix CTL underscore, and this is a button. Let's call this button 1. Okay. And so now when we go to, oops, try this again, press enter, button 1. Try this again, I'm not selecting it apparently. Oh, you know what? We have a button 1 over there already, so let's call this button 2. So on, and then on click. When we click on this little square over here, we're going to create a new function down at the bottom of the event code section in the code editor. And you can see it's created a nice little template for the function, and it's created 2 variables by default. NS refers to the entire application, and then the UI control refers to just the widget. So we can refer to other widgets using NS. And so let's change the text on the face of the other button using some autocomplete here. So what I'm going to do is do NS, that refers to the application, and dot, and what you're going to see is you get all these things that all these properties of the current application. One of those properties is the control S button 1. So let's do that. And now you can see these are our properties of the S button 1. And one of the things we can do, you can get all these properties here, which are all the properties you see over on the right-hand side of the visual builder. And then you have all these set properties. So we can set the caption of that, and it gives you the exact format and saves you from making typing mistakes. So this autocomplete is super, super helpful, especially when you're learning. And let's set the caption to that S1 button to clicked. Very tough keyboard here, so it's a little bit longer to type. Try this again, clicked. Okay, so now when we click on the this button, let's change that to this button 2, and let's go back in here and we can adjust this how we want. We'll call this the S button 2 on click function. Cool. And now I'm going to take this code in the normal full installation of jsLinb. When you run it online, got a nice little run button here. And if you have PHP installed and you're running this on a server with PHP installed, you can just click that run button and it'll run the application. So it's a really nice quick development cycle. I'm going to show you that here just for a moment. Let's do this. jsLinb, I'm going to show you the UI builder. So this is now running on a URL. I've just uploaded this jsLinb, unzipped it on a server, and I've got this builder. And I can just click run, and you can see it runs the application. Very nice and easy, and you can work with it that way. So everything works as it's supposed to on a server, but I didn't want to have PHP be a requirement in this toolkit, so we've got a little more manual way of just looking at the results. So you've seen this already. I'm going to take all the code, Control-C. I'm going to go back to my test.js, paste that in there, save it, and then I'm going to go back to that test I grabbed the wrong code here, but I'm going to go back to this test, and I'm going to do Control and F5 to force this to refresh. And now we've got that code that I copied. I copied it from the other builder, so let's do that here. Code, Control-A, Control-C, I'll tab over to here, Control-A, Control-V, save it, Control-S, and then tab back over here, run it, and Control function F5, and now we've got a complete development cycle, and that application is now running. That full front-end application is running in a browser without having to have any other sort of backend. Click me, and you can see the application has run as expected. Let's reset it here. You can see it's initially click me, click here, and it does clicked. If I click on this one, it does the function that's assigned to run when that's clicked. So that's a basic run through of how the jsLinb environment works. There's a lot more features here, and of course you have some syntax checking, and you've got a nice little find and replace, and some formatting features in this simple little IDE. But the killer feature is autocomplete and also the visual layout designer. So let's go back. I'm going to refresh this. If you do that, you lose your code, which is what we want here. We want to get ourselves a nice fresh view. And what we're going to do is go back and look at example number 1, tutorial number 1. So I'm going to take this code. I'm going to copy that into I'm just going to show you it in the Visual Builder. And what we've done here is basically what I just showed you. I'm going to go over to code, and these jsLinb applications are all single file applications. You can create, of course, many more pages that have application code, but each one of these code files is a single file, so you store them all in a single JavaScript file. So if I go back to the design view, you can see we've got here another button, and all I did here was change the text that's alerted when the user clicks on it. So if I put that into my test.js file, We'll go back over to the browser. Get our test.html and do a forced control and F5 in Chrome. Whatever you need to do to force this, you can see now the code that we had in that tutorial 1 file is now running. So fairly simple work routine. Just paste the generated code into test.js, refresh the test.html page, and you've got the application running. So let's go over now and get tutorial number 2. Let's take a look at the code for that. And just to show you, I'm going to take that and paste it back into, we don't need to do this because it's already created, but I'm going to show you here in the builder. Just run this. You kind of just go back and forth between the builder and your running app. Let's go to the designer. Let's see here, so you can see we still got a button. Let's take a look at the code. And the big difference in this code is that when we click on the button, we are now going to run an AJAX function. And so this is the main thing you need to learn how to do to interact with the back end. And this is a little familiar kind of AJAX sort of template that you'll see in other jQuery style interactions with AJAX. And we run the limb.ajax function inside this onClick function, this onClick handler, and we put the URL that we want to read. Now, if you remember, we created in the bottle backend a localhost /read path, and that sent us back a bunch of JSON data that included all the information in the database. And there is an empty string here. This is any payload that we want to send along to that URL. This is the GET request. And we can also send POST requests and so on, but in this case, we're just going to send a GET request with no payload. We're not going to do, if we were, for example, going to do a question mark and a name and a value for the name, we're not going to do any of that. We're just reading. All we want to do is go to this URL and have the server send us back some information. The first thing we do here, the response function, or the function with the response variable, is a success response. If this function is successfully read on the server and there's no errors, what we're going to do is run lim.message, and I'm going to get the name value from the first row in that response. And then the next function is an error response, and what we're going to do to handle the error response. So in this case, the error would be presented. So let's take this code, copy it into our test.js file, and then we'll run that in the browser. And again, all I'm doing is just doing a forced refresh, control F5 to make sure that it's loading the HTML and the new JS. So let's click me, and looks like I didn't get the right code. Let's try this again. So here is our code, control A, control C. Let's make sure we can make this work here. Looks like I pasted it into the wrong file. Put it in the test file. Go back to our browser. Run the application, control function 5. Now we got our button, click me, and now you can see it has sent that request to the localhost or localhost /read function, got all the rows back, and we've just displayed the first, the name value in the first row. Try that again, request, do it again, do it a couple more times. You can see every time it's getting that request from the server. So now connected with the server, we're reading the JSON, and we're going to use some standard JavaScript interactions to do these sorts of things over and over now. Let's take a look at the next tutorial. That was tutorial 2. Let's look at tutorial 3. And of course, I don't really need to put this into the editor. I'm just kind of showing you some of the workflow of how to grab an existing application, an existing jsLinb application, put it into the builder, and then you can now work with that application, adjust it as you need. Okay, so let's take a look at the design, see what's changed. Okay, so now in this case, you can see in the visual builder, we have now a button that says read rows, and we have a little input area. And if you look in this input area, I've set one of the properties to be multi-line. So this is the same thing that you see if you have a single line widget for text entry. Set it to multi-lines, stretch it out, drag it. You can use the bars here to visually size that, or you can do, again, shift and arrow keys, or shift and control and arrow keys to do it in fine increments. Okay, so let's take a look at the code. Of course, those code changes for that little widget that I just adjusted are now reflected here in this code. So we have, to the layout, we have a button appended and an input widget appended. Down here in the events, in the event handling section, in response to that button one on-click event, we run this function. Again, UI control refers to the widget, which we don't really need here. And again, what we're doing is sending a lim AJAX request to the server. And we're reading again from the local host, getting a bunch of rows back. And what we're going to do this time, when that is successful, this time we're changing the function a little bit. We're going through a for loop. And so for row in response, we're going to put lim message and put the row name. So we're going to get a whole bunch of lim messages when we run this. So let's copy this. And again, I didn't have to do all this I didn't have to copy it to the builder if I didn't want. It was kind of taking you through the whole round trip process of saving an application. You can save this, of course, to any JS file that you want to. And to run it, all we do is take whatever code we're working with. So I typically work just with this little test.js file. Paste this in here, Control save, go back to the app, and then refresh it. So now we've got that new layout. And if I do read rows, blam, 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 you can see we've got all of the names from all of the rows in the database. Let's do that a few times. And you can see each of those requests very, very quick. So you've got John, Bruce, Bob, Jim, Bill, Joseph, Joe, John Jones, and so on. Okay, so for this example, we actually didn't need the little text area, but we'll use it next. Okay, so I'm going to go back and let's just take a look at the code itself. We don't have to use the visual editor right now because we're not going to make any changes. So I'm going to take this code, open it up, and just, and it, if I was working on an application, I just keep it in test.js. I'm just going to paste it into test.js, save it, go back over to my editor and refresh it, and we're done. That's the whole workflow process, really simple. Click read rows. And let me see what I did differently here. See if there's anything kind of flying by the seat of my pants here. Okay, so the only difference in this example, and make sure I got this right here. The only difference in this example, and I may be actually thinking of another one, what I meant to do with this one was use a slightly different for loop. So let's open up the next example. I'm going to show you what I did with the for loop. That really was the same example. Let's try tutorial 5, and you'll see. So because jsLinb is meant to run in older browsers, it works perfectly fine in newer browsers, but new features in JavaScript won't run in old browsers. So what I've done here with this example 5 is I've used a slightly older JavaScript type of for loop, because that new type of for loop that you saw in the previous example doesn't run in a lot of the old browsers. So this is an older style for loop where we create a variable row. Oh, I'm sorry, no, we don't do that here. What we're doing is using the same for loop, and what we're doing is now for each of these rows, we're creating a string and concatenating, adding to it, appending to it the rows variable. Each of the names in each of the rows plus a new line. And then we're setting that ns.control1 input value to the rows. I think actually I can move this out here. Let's actually make that change. We'll put it outside of the for loop. So once that is completely done, let's adjust this a little bit, just so that it's not inputting those variables each time into the the visual widget. I'm just going to do this here. So we run a for loop, build up this rows variable. Originally it's set to a string, and then run through each of the rows in the response. When we get a successful response, concatenate each row onto that rows variable, contents, the name contents in each of those rows, and then finally set the value, the UI value of input 1 to be those rows. So it's going to get all those values and then put it in the UI widget you see there. So I'm going to paste this code into test, save it, go back over to the browser, refresh it. And at this point, we're not using the visual editor because we don't need to. We're just adjusting the code. Read the rows, and now we should get all of those variables, all those values in the widget. So I'll do it again. And if I were to refresh this, let's do it again. Read the rows, you can see how quick it is. So pretty simple. So now we're dealing with the JSON that's being returned by those bottle functions and putting the elements that we want into a widget. The core of using a front-end system to interact with the back-end system. I think we're on number 6. So let's try this one now and take a look at this. So here I had mentioned, this is the example in which I used a slightly different sort of older style for loop. This is a lot like what you see in C++ or some older languages, where we create a starting variable, set it to 0, go to a variable which is the length of the number of rows, and then increase it by 1 each time. And then we're doing the same thing we did before. We're creating our rows variable, getting the name from each row in the database results, appending a new line character, and then setting that variable. Let's run this once and I'll show you how this works. And if we're on a really slow machine, what would happen here, because I actually in this code put the set UI function inside the for loop, it's actually updating that user interface in each iteration of the loop. So let's do that first. And if we have a slow enough machine, you may actually see that happen. I don't know if it's going to be slow enough on this machine to do it, but refresh this and let's run that code. Aha. Okay, so this is a nice little thing to happen here. We've got an application that's not running. So I'm going to use the inspector, the Google inspector. This is the Chrome inspector. We can see what's going on in the console, and you'll see errors. Okay, so failed to unexpected string in text.js. So let's take a look at what's happening in the bottle server. Let's see if we can get any sort of information about what's happening in the bottle server. And we did get 404 for the favicon. Okay, so let's go back over to this and see what we've got. Make sure we have saved everything properly. We got a string here. I don't want to spend a lot of time debugging this, but let's see if we've got anything obvious here. Rows equals rows plus response. That's good. Okay, so let's refresh this. See what we get. We got a little A little debugging to do. Control function F5. And, okay, so test.js at line 50, character 7. Okay, so line 50. Okay, so something up here. Oh, ha. Okay, so it looks like what I've done is just I copied and pasted the code twice. So let's do that again. Back here, paste it in. Let's make sure I've saved this properly. Okay, is that correct? Yeah, it looks correct this time. So go back to a browser, run the app again. And there we go. So I'm going to close up the inspector, read rows. And that was pretty dang fast. you don't even see it refresh. But in the interest of improving this little example, I'm going to take this line out just like I did in the last example. Take it out here. Let's do it again. Take it out here. And I don't want to update the UI value every time I run an iteration of the for loop. I want to do that whole for loop, build up the rows variable, build up the contents, the string that's stored in the rows variable. And then when that's all done, I want to update the variable. Let me copy that, paste that into here too. So this is, and look what I managed to do. I managed to copy only that row. So Control C, it's back into here. And I'll save that example so it's in the download package the way we want. Okay. So let's go back to our browser, run this one more time. Should run exactly the same. I'll do a forced refresh. Control and F5 in Chrome. And there we go. Super, super fast. Okay, let's take a look at the next example. It's working. Go back to our UI folder. We did number 7. Let's try number 8. And we'll open this up. Let's close some of these other files down so that we don't need them anymore. And remember, this whole time, all of these front ends are running on example 8, where we just had a bunch of bottle and bottle and PyDAL code performing CRUD operations in the bottle using the bottle framework. Let's take a look at what's going on here. I can see I've added a list. So let's run this. And we've got the same sort of for loop. I tend to stick with the old style for loops because one of the main benefits of using jsLinb is that I want to be able to run in old browsers, and that new for some variable in some list doesn't run in the old browsers. So I like to use this old style for, even though it's a little more verbose. A for loop like this will work in basically every browser that's been around. And since most of the time you're going to be using other than, simple JavaScript like that, you're going to be using the API in jsLinb. As long as you stay with the jsLinb API, these applications will run in just about every old browser, ancient browsers, as well as new browsers. A really fantastic benefit of using jsLinb. Okay, so it looks like what we're going to do here is collect a bunch of rows again, and we're going to now, instead of being a string, that rows variable is a list, and we're now appending to that rows value the name and the name value on each row, and then we're going to set the list items to be that rows variable when it's done. And again, let's take this out of this line, and we'll improve that code a little bit. That shouldn't have an update every single time. Particularly difficult mouse to use here, but look at this and delete. Particularly different keyboard to use too. Okay, and we'll put that at the end of the for loop. Much better. Save that, and here we'll copy it to test.js. And I managed to just copy and paste that. Let's try it again. Control A, C, and then Control A, V. Save it. Go back to our browser, wherever it is here. Go. And do a forced, you can do also control and refresh on the browser here. So now you can see we've got a list widget, read rows, and ta-da, now we've got list. So this is not just a text field, this is actually a list that you can scroll if we have more usernames. And let's, for the sake of seeing how this works, we'll put it back into the jsLinb builder. I've copied and pasted that. So if we wanted, we could make our changes here, adjust, for example, the sizing. And in fact, let's make that sizing a little smaller just so we can see it scroll. Let's do this. Good, make it nice and small. And you can see that those changes have been adjusted in the code. And we could do all sorts more if we wanted, for example, to do something when a name was clicked. We could do that. Over here, we could do, for example, on item selected. Let's do that. And we'll just do a quick little, let's see if we can just alert selected. Find the code here, alert. We'll just do right now the word selected. And okay, so we'll copy that code over. You can see the benefit of using the visual builder making changes much quicker than having to go back and forth between code and a running version. Control and refresh. Now you can see we've got a smaller layout and a scroll bar that's automatically inserted. So exactly what you'd expect for that sort of widget and how a user would expect it to work. Okay, so I'm going to go back to these files. I'm going to save that final version back into my tutorial.js file. And to be clear how this works, this test.js file is just a file in our UI folder. And the test.html file that we're opening in the browser. Let's see if I can get this open here. My mouse does not like to cooperate. There we go. Open with Notepad++. And you can see the contents of the HTML file. Basically, there's some meta data and some information about the doc type, the head and the body. We're importing the jsLinb files. This is sort of a standard stock boilerplate HTML file. And then we're also importing the test.js file. So every time we refresh the HTML file, we're also, when we force that refresh, we're also refreshing this test.js file that we are working in. You also see here we have a theme set to Aqua. There are several default themes in jsLinb. I like the Aqua one. And a little bit more code just to stop that loading visualization you see in the beginning. Okay, so that's how this works. The test.js that we're actually working in holds all the code that is created by the visual layout designer. You just pop this into the test.js file. You can call it whatever other file name you want. And typically you'll rename that test.html something like index.html, and maybe this would be renamed index.js, and you'll import the index.js file in the index.html code. You can rename those files however you need, but for our workflow, this works just fine for now. So let's go to our next example. It's to work here. This mouse is troublesome. Okay, so let's do tutorial 9. Take a look at what we've done here and see what we've got. So just going through this, I can see I've got a button, I've got a list, I've got another input, I've got another button, another input, another button, and so on. So I've added some more widgets to the layout. That was done using the visual layout editor. And then down at the bottom, I've got a number of functions that are going to handle each of the clicks on each of those buttons. So let's go back over here to our editor, our visual editor, UI builder. we'll paste that code in so we can see what we've got here. And so you can see, as you saw in the code, there's a button on top, nice big list, another input, which is called input note. I created that input note. And let's take a look at the code over here so you can see that note widget, just so you get a little bit more idea how this jsLinb code works. You got a list. Here's an input, input name. Then we have a button. Here's the input note. You can see that the set multi-lines property is set to true. So everything that you see in the code is reflected in a property that you can adjust over here in the properties panel. The visual editor just lets you do that easily. It kind of guides you through when you don't know what all that code is. But as you get to know the code, you can manually adjust it, manually add things you want, go back and forth, round trip between the what you see is what you get editor, the visual editor, drag and drop editor, and work with code. If you do something wrong, if you put, some sort of syntax, it'll tell you that you've got some syntax improper. So here you can see unknown token, comma, delete that, and you can see the error goes away. So really nice little useful system. So let's take a look now at what we've actually got happening here. I'm going to go back to these buttons and look at the on-click events. The on-click event here I've set to be this function, button read on-click. So button read rows. So that button, when it's clicked, is going to run this button read on click function. And you can see that that is the Ajax function, lim Ajax function that you've got familiar with so far. It reads the data that's returned from localhost, doesn't send any request information, just reads the data. And then for the success function, when that read is successful, it performs this code, which is similar to what you've seen before, but you can see here it also sets the value of this input back to empty and this note input back to empty. So it's going to clear any values that are in those input widgets. Okay, then let's go back into the design view and just take a look. When the update button is clicked, it's going to run this button on update. What is it? Button update on click function. So let's look at that code, and it's similar. Control-1 S button update on click gives you that same little default bit of code, and then it runs a lim Ajax function. And in this function, we're getting data from the endpoint at localhost /update. So we're running the bottle function that was at this route, the update route. And in this case, now we're sending some data. So this is something we didn't see in the read function, because up here, we did not send any request. At this point, what we're doing is sending some values. So we're setting the name, just as you saw in the browser before, we're setting the name to be a variable, which is this selected name, which we'll cover in a second. You'll see that elsewhere. And then, and we're setting the new name to be the value that's in the input name widget, and then the new note variable to be the value which is in the input note widget. So we're getting the values out of those text fields and sending them to this URL, which is handled by the bottle on the back end. And then when we get a successful return, we're just returning the entire response, which is going to be an updated row number. And then we're also running the S button read on click function, which is the one we saw. So basically, we're going to update the list once we're going to update the visual display of that list widget once we've updated the value in the database. And so running this S button read on click is just going to refresh the list that you see on screen. Let's keep going. If we go back to the design view, click on the delete, you're going to see that when that's clicked, it runs the button delete on click handler. And here we have that handler. Where is it? Delete. So same sort of format. This button, when it's clicked, is going to send a request out to localhost/delete, which is handled by Bottle on the back end. And what we're sending it is name equals, and then the selected name. That's set previously or in another function. We'll see that in a second. So this is a global variable. I just made that a simple global variable so that you can get the data from any of these functions. And when that function is performed, we get a success return from that request on the server. We're gonna pop up a message showing the response. And then again, we're gonna run the S button read on click function so it refreshes the list in the user, the list widget. And then finally, we have one more button here, button create. And create, all we're going to do is set, so out of the way, I have a little bit of a visual recorder here that's in the way. So the S button create on click handler is going to run an AJAX function, which sends a request to the localhost/create route, runs the function there, and we're going to send it some request data. I should actually say and name, or not and name, just name, equals whatever is in the input name widget, and set the note to whatever is in the input note widget, whatever's displayed in those widgets on screen. And when we get a success function, we're going to pop up the response showing that it's been created. And again, we're going to run the S button read on click to refresh the display list. So we've also got one more function here, which if we go to the actual layout, the canvas element, and we click on the onReady handler, this creates an onReady handler so that whenever the user interface is displayed in the browser, it runs this function. And what it's going to do is run the same old function we've seen in all these other handlers. We're going to run the S button read on click function, which was this. We're just running this in each case to refresh, to read the current data from the database on the server and display it in the list widget. Okay, and then there is one other function here. So if I look at the widget for the list, you can see we've got one of the most common operations events is when an item is selected. So it created this function just by clicking here. So whenever an item is selected from that drop-down widget, we're going to run this code. And again, remember, this is just boilerplate, creates this by default every time. So you can refer to the entire application, or you can refer to just the user widget that was clicked on or the event occurred on. And so what we're doing is we're going to set the value of the input name widget to whatever is in that selected row in the list, in the widget, in the what is that called? The widget list, the list widget. And then we're also going to set the input note, the little text entry area, to the widget ID that's been selected. So basically, we're getting the note and the name from each of those users and putting them and displaying them in these inputs, in these little input widgets. We're also setting a global variable, which you've seen a couple of times, this selected name. So list refers to the entire, and JavaScript refers to the entire application and the entire user interface. And selected name variable is being set to that item caption the caption property of the item that's been selected, so that we can refer to it later, as you've seen a few times in these other functions. So let's take all of this, put it into our test. Hopefully I haven't made any mistakes. Save it. No, any syntax errors because the ID would have shown us that. Control function F5, and blam. Now we've got, you can see this has been populated by the initial read function that was run during the event ready event. Click read row, and it will reload. If I select a user there, it populates these two fields. So click on each of the users. If I want to update this to another bit of text, the cloud formations, to update, it's going to clear out those two fields. And now when we look at it, you can see, or which one was that on? There we go. Bruce likes cloud formations. And of course, we could change that name. Let's change another name. Change Bob to Bobby, and I'll just say cat. Bob will like his cat. And we'll update that database record. So now it's been cleared. When we click on Bob, you can see it's Bobby, and he likes his cat. If I want to delete that, click on delete. Bam, it's gone. And if I want to create a file, now look, I have empty fields here. I'll create. And you can see we've got now an empty field here. I can put in, let's make a Nick. Oops, try this again. Nick likes jsLinb. And we will update that, and you can see it's been refreshed. We're going to make some changes to how this works later on, but you can see that we've got the full CRUD functionality, and now both the front end and the back end. The front end is connected to each of those bottle endpoints, and those bottle endpoints are saving the information in the SQLite database. If we want to migrate to another database, we just change that connection string. If we want to do other operations with the database, we just write bottle endpoints that perform those operations. And if we want to display this information in other widgets and make other user interface changes, we can do that very easily with the user interface builder. So we're going to do some more with this. I'm going to show you some more features of the builder, but that's enough to get all the basic CRUD operations working. That's a good starting point to begin being able to interact with bottle, PyDAL, and jsLinb all as a complete toolkit to build applications. And all you need to do is save your test.js, call it whatever file you want, save your test.html, put that on a web server. You can put on a web host. You can, a shared web host, any machine that can run Python, just download this package, unzip it onto that machine. It can be a mobile phone, it can be a tablet. You can host this stuff without an internet connection, all on a single machine. It can be a desktop, it can be Linux, it can be a Chromebook, it can be any sort of environment. As long as you have Python, this entire backend framework and the visual designer all will run on those machines. And any person that wants to connect to that application running just goes to the IP address or the URL of the server and connects to the index HTML you've created. That's it. That's the full workflow process. Very simple. The code created by jsLinb is it's not necessarily succinct, but it's very simple to read. And it's very easy to adjust, very, very readable. And most of that code is created with the visual editor, so it's very simple. You can see these AJAX requests all follow the same syntax. So again, although they're not short, they're very readable, very easy to understand. And if you do just a little bit of work with this, you'll see it's very, very simple to interact. And it's typical web framework, the way you'd see in Python and in JavaScript. So if you want to replace this then with jQuery, if you want to replace it with some other framework, I'm going to cover Metro for UI, but you can use MUI, you can use MDB, you can use any framework based on any of the big the React or Angular or Svelte or Vue, as long as you can connect with the backend using HTTP requests, so AJAX or even just ancient forms, you can replace this front end with any other framework that you'd like. So hopefully that gets you going. We'll stop there, and I'll make some more videos to show some more features of jsLinb, just so you've got a good working knowledge of how to actually do layouts with it.